Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And we have with us, live in the studio, Dr. Gary Ostrower, longtime Alfred history professor. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for coming in.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
Now, usually when we talk to you, you're over in the Wlea area at St. Bonaventure University. Are you off for the summers?
I am, as a matter of fact. I'm the ombudsman at St. Bonaventure, and just in case anyone doesn't know what an ombudsman is, the word ombuds is a Swedish word, and it kind of means problem solver, mediator, conflict resolution, that sort of thing. And I do that work both at St. Bonaventure and I'm also the ombuds officer at Alfred University. I've been doing that at Alfred for about 15, 16 years or so, and at St. Bonaventure just finishing up my 10th year.
What's the average, problem or situation that you have to deal with as an ombudsman?
Well, it's very, very varied. I mean, the one thing I can say is that when anyone walks into my office, they're not going to be smiling. These are people who, to one extent or another, are troubled by something. If I had to say average, it would probably be a student who has a problem with a professor, or it might be a faculty member who has a beef with his or her department chair or with the dean or something along those lines. But, Brian, as I say, it's very, very hard to generalize. I deal with everything from, people who are complaining about members of the food service who aren't wearing gloves when they're serving food to, parents who believe that their kids are in dormitory rooms that the student is unhappy with. A little bit of everything.
And not to make this the whole show, although we couldn't, it would be interesting, but when you get a situation where a student is not pleased with the grades, would that go through your office?
Occasionally, if the student believes that the reason for the a poor grade is not his own performance or her own performance, but rather that the professor is being unfair. So that might come through. But if it has to do with sexual discrimination or racial discrimination or something along those lines, then it goes to a different area of the university altogether, what we call a Title IX officer, and that refers to the Title IX of the Educational Act of 1972, which mandates that, at least at the college level, that the schools, if they receive federal funding, that the schools cannot discriminate on the basis of race or on the basis of sex.
On that topic, and this is kind of interesting, actually, is there a Title X officer? Because that's a big thing.
No, there is not. And if you ask me what Title X is, I'd have to say I have no clue. I really don't know. But every college has a Title IX officer. When I say every college which does receive federal funding. If they receive no federal funding at all, then, of course, they're exempt. But I would guess that 99.8% of all colleges in the United States receive at least some form of federal funding, whether it's financial aid for some of their students or contracts for research or whatever it might be.
Well, there's so much to talk about today. This day in history, you've got Midway from World War II, Tiananmen Square from the late 1980s. We wanted to talk about the president's trip to the UK and how Senator John McCain's in the news lately. What would you like to start out with?
Well, let's start out with Senator McCain. Actually, I would like to make one real quick point about something that I heard Jonathan Mark saying just before I got here. The issue of undocumented aliens, undocumented immigrants with driver's licenses. There are about 12 states, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 11, but I think 12 states that require them to have driver's licenses and that grant them the right to have driver's licenses. And the argument has been in favor of that, that it makes them better drivers. That is to say, our roads are safer. Jonathan had said, as a matter of fact, for those of our listeners who were tuned in just a few minutes ago, that he doesn't know how that would make driving safer. And the answer is that if you have a license, that is to say, if you're allowed to get a license and you're required to get a license before you drive, you have to pass a driving test. It's really that simple. It's also a matter that if you have a license, you have to drive with insurance. So that in some ways secures, at least financially in the event of an accident, those of us who might be struck by a car driven by someone else. But I think the key thing, of course, is that you have to go through you have to take a driving test, and that driving test requires a certain amount of study, a certain amount of instruction in safe driving. It's really that simple. But the other thing I wanted to get going on today was what happened with the USS John McCain. The White House, you may know, and most of our listeners probably are aware, that when President Trump visited Japan, he was told, not as he was told, but the Navy was told to remove the USS John McCain, which is a naval craft, a warship, from his site. That he did not like John McCain, and he wanted nothing to do with John McCain, and he didn't want to see that ship, did not want to see the name in his site. And I thought, wow, I mean, you talk about inappropriate behavior. Eventually, of course it was inappropriate. Can you imagine, say, a George Washington or an Abraham Lincoln or a Franklin Roosevelt acting in quite the same way? And the answer, of course, we could not. It says something about, I think, the president's resentfulness. It says something about his personality. It says something about a man with what, in fact, is really quite a weak ego. And so the Defense Department, if I'm not mistaken, refused to remove the ship. Now, the White House eventually first denied that they had said that, and then they said, well, the order was given by some kind of a 23-year-old or a 24-year-old in the White House who didn't know what he was doing. Well, if you believe that, I suppose you're ready to buy the George Washington Bridge. But again, I think that, we have a president who's simply breaking the rules, who's breaking all those norms, and who really doesn't have, if you will, the character to face up to, if you will, criticism. I noticed, by the way, that in his trip to London, just yesterday, there are a number of people wearing hats, red hats that look like MAGA hats, Make America Great Again hats, but in fact, it didn't say Make America Great Again. It said USS John McCain.
Dr. Ostrower, on the topic of Trump responding to every criticism that's made of him, usually that's done on Twitter. Do you think that this is setting a precedent for presidents to bypass the media and put a lot of statements out on social media?
Well, I hope not. I mean, we may see more of this. And I think that, you're kind of raising a larger question, and that is, what effect is Trump going to have on future presidencies? Not only on future presidencies, but on American policies that, to one extent or another, are being challenged by the Trump administration. And the short answer to the question is we really don't know. Are we going to revert back, maybe with some changes, to where we were before, or are we really going to be in a very, very different kind of political environment? So he's only two and a half years into his presidency. He may have another 1.5 years left. He may have another, 6.5 years left, 5.5 years left. We really don't know at this point. I hope certainly that he's not setting a precedent, but I think that by and large there's the weight of history, and I'm talking about 230 years of American presidential history, of American political history. In other words, ever since 1789, when George Washington became president. Washington set a standard, and the standard was one of decorum. It was respect for people who you may disagree with. It was a sense that the presidency carries a certain kind of respect itself, and I think that Trump, unfortunately, is undermining that. But one would have to assume that, as I'm saying, the weight of history will prevail, and that we will at least kind of revert back to more normal procedures after he leaves office.
What do you make of the whole thing of these of the mayor of London? I don't know if he's involved with putting those anti-Trump those big balloons up over in England, but he allows them. what do you make of that and all the protests?
Well, England happens to be a free country, and if you want to protest, you're free to protest, as presumably you should be here. You know, it's kind of interesting. I think that Trump would love a country where there is no freedom to protest, and that's one of the reasons why he admires the North Korean dictator. That's one of the reasons why he admires President Putin of Russia and Erdogan. You know, these are people who don't have much tolerance for protest at all. When people protest here, the president is usually very, very angry in one way or another, and he tries to demean them or he tries to insult them. And then when the newspapers report on this, he usually calls it fake news. I mean, this is not a healthy situation for the United States right now. But in England, yeah, you're free to protest. Is the mayor of London encouraging this protest? I have no idea. But I do know this. The mayor of London has made some sharply critical comments about Trump. And in return, Trump has just yesterday made a very, very sharply critical comment about the mayor of London. You know, he called him nasty. He demeaned the fact that he's a relatively short person. And for the president of the United States to get into a kind of spat, into a political quarrel with the mayor of a city, I find to be astounding. This has never happened before, and one has to hope it's never going to happen again.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get to the Battle of Midway, World War II, and Tiananmen Square, 1989. Stay with us.
So you sit down and you do your budget, and you look at all your monthly costs, your bills, your income, and it seems like there's never quite enough. You know what would help? What would really help? Finding $500 a month to help balance things out. And that is the typical savings, $500 a month for a family when you switch to MediShare for your health care. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. No wonder more than 400,000 people are doing this now. And look, whether you're single or married or you have kids, this can make sitting down to do a monthly budget a lot more fun. Just think what you could do with $500 a month. It can cover a car payment or pay back loans or whatever. Join MediShare and go out to dinner to celebrate. Find out more. The MediShare people are so easy to talk to. They can answer any questions. They're super friendly. Call 877-26-BIBLE. That's 877-26-BIBLE. 877-26-BIBLE.
Been a bit of a cooler morning, and to start out with, meteorologist Rob Carolyn says it's been in the 30s throughout different parts of the state.
That's right, Brian. We started the morning out at 39 in Rome, 32 degrees this morning in Saranac Lake. They're up to 40. Saw a couple of 37s, 38s this morning around Elmira, Corning, and then out towards the Jamestown area. But all of those areas have now come up. Coldest I'm seeing in the region would be down towards Bradford, Pennsylvania. They're still 38 right now, which is pretty impressive being 2.5 weeks away from the summer solstice. Brian, we start out with lots of sunshine, but there's a warm front developing off to our north and west. Some of the cloudiness with that right now is flirting with Buffalo. It'll drift in today and will gradually turn mostly cloudy. You could see a couple of showers before the day is over with 65 to 70. Sun came up this morning at 5:34. It'll set tonight at 8:43. Tonight we're cloudy. That warm front bisecting the state will help produce a couple of showers overnight. 55 to 60 for the low. Tomorrow clouds, scattered showers and thunderstorms in the afternoon, 75 to 80. Showers Wednesday night, lows near 60. Thursday, it'll turn partly sunny. We'll see a high of 75. And, Brian, if everything holds together, we could be in for a good day Friday and perhaps the weekend as well.
And we're on live with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, the Queen, I believe, invited President Trump to come over. Question, is President Trump using the trip to push Brexit? Is that his big focus?
Well, he has said very little about Brexit. Look, Brexit in England, I mean, England's a mess right now. If you think we got problems, the English have even greater problems. And, of course, Brexit is at the very, very center of that. The president has done something, again, which is really very, very unusual. He has waded into the politics of a foreign country. He has argued the case that Brexit would be good for England. He has patted on the back a guy by the name of Neil Farage, who is leading the case for Brexit. This man is right on the fascist fringe. Okay, I wouldn't call him a fascist, but he's not far from it. These are things that have certainly not made the president very popular in England. By the same token, the English are really divided. I mean, Brexit, the referendum for Brexit, over Brexit, won by about 2 percentage points. In other words, the British public, by a vote of around 52 to 48% back in 2016, voted for Brexit. And while that vote might not be the same today, my hunch is that if there was a vote, Brexit would probably lose. The fact is that a large proportion of the British public, maybe a minority, but still a very, very substantial portion, would support Brexit. What I find kind of interesting about this trip by Trump is that, number one, he really has not said very much about Brexit. So obviously, he's been well trained on that score. And secondly, he's getting into an area where, and this I think says something about Trump's larger foreign policy, to the extent that you can even say there is a foreign policy, he's kind of an isolationist. And America and England had rejected that kind of isolationism, beginning with Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And never have we seen a more close relationship than you did with these two countries during the D-Day invasion almost exactly 75 years ago on June 6th, of course, of 1944. D-Day came to symbolize, if you will, that very, very special relationship between the British and the Americans, and of course the Canadians were involved in all of that. And then following the war, and it was not simply following the war, even during the war, we saw that relationship further developed in such things as the Bretton Woods agreements of 1944, which created the International Monetary Fund and created the World Bank. In other words, what you had was the development of a post-war world that involved cooperation. And that cooperation has meant two things. Number one, it has meant unparalleled prosperity for America, for Europe. We haven't sunk back into a Great Depression. It has also meant not only prosperity, but has meant that there has not been a general war in Europe since the Second World War. I think we better not underestimate the importance of those things. And Trump's reversion to isolationism, Trump's reversion to the idea that let's ignore the United Nations, let's ignore the IMF and the World Bank and so forth, let's ignore the kind of cooperation that the U.S. involved itself with England and other European countries in respect to the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine and the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NATO Treaty Organization in 1949. I think that Trump's rejection of all of this is very, very dangerous, and I think that we're going to pay a high price for that if, in fact, we see the disintegration of this Atlantic alliance.
Do you think that privately the Queen would, do you think Trump would go to her for any advice, or do you think she gives any advice to him?
I doubt very much, and I don't think that the president takes very much advice from anybody, not his own cabinet members, not people like H.R. McMaster, who are very, very supportive of the alliance that I'm talking about, people like Jim Mattis. These people are out of the administration, and they're out of the administration because they have found themselves in such fundamental disagreement with President Trump over the very, very issues that we're talking about right now.
On to this day in history, 1942, Battle of Midway.
Well, the Battle of Midway was really, really important. And again, for those people who may not have much memory of that kind of thing, there were two battles during World War II that were, I think, the key battles of the entire war. One was in Eastern Europe, and the Americans had no particular connection with that, and that was the Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad, which began in September of 1942 and didn't end until late January of 1943, really was the turning point in Europe. The turning point, in other words, of war, that the Nazis were winning until the Battle of Stalingrad. And after the Battle of Stalingrad, it really became increasingly clear that the Nazis were going to lose the war, that Hitler would lose the war. And I might add, by the way, that Battle of Stalingrad led to approximately 1 million casualties on the part of the Soviets, and again, 1 million casualties on the part of the Germans. It was an incredibly destructive battle. On the other side of the world, at approximately roughly the same time, the Battle of Midway occurred. The United States entered the war in December of 1941 at Pearl Harbor. I think we all know that. The Japanese planned that battle brilliantly. Okay, they planned that attack brilliantly, but they did not do two things that they should have done if they were to win the war in the Pacific. Number one, they were unable to destroy any of the American aircraft carriers because our aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack. And secondly, they did not destroy the oil storage facilities, nor did they destroy the dry docks. And those dry docks were able to they were used to repair most, not all, but most of the ships that had been destroyed, that had been attacked, I should say, that had been damaged during the Pearl Harbor attack. And the reason I mention that is some of those ships were involved then in the Battle of Midway, which occurs in June of 1942. The Battle of Midway was the second battle in world history where the two navies, did not ever see, they never set sight on each other. About a month earlier, there had been a battle at the Coral Sea, which was similarly true, and likewise with Midway. The Battle of Midway was fought by the planes from aircraft carriers, from the Japanese carriers that attacked the American fleet, from the American aircraft carriers, those planes that attacked the Japanese fleet. By the end of that battle, the Japanese had lost 4 of their aircraft carriers. We lost 1, and the Japanese, while they were able to, obviously continue some naval construction, they never really recovered from the Battle of Midway. They had hoped that battle would lead to their control of the Central Pacific. They, of course, failed in that, and from that point on, as I say, the war really turned. And let me say one last thing, if I may, about the Battle of Midway. Until the Battle of Midway, Churchill and Roosevelt had assumed that the war would be fought in Europe, that we would fight a war in Europe, just a holding action in the Pacific until after Germany had been defeated. But after the Battle of Midway, that strategy changed, and the United States began the process of what we called island hopping. Within about 3 or 4 months, we were involved in a battle at Guadalcanal, which is not all that far from Australia. That was the point at which the Japanese had advanced the furthest in their expansion program in the Pacific, and that Battle of Guadalcanal would eventually lead to the battles at Saipan and Tinian and many, many other islands, some of which probably we've heard of, some of which most of us have not heard of, until finally, of course, those critical battles at Iwo Jima and at Okinawa, and that allowed us to end the war finally with the atomic bombing of Japan.
We have to leave it there, Dr. Ostrower. I want to thank you so much for coming in.
Well, thanks again for having me here.